Thank you very much. Thank you for that very kind introduction. I'm really thrilled to be here, I must tell you, without my colleagues from the Capital Gang. You know, sometimes we do road shows together and travel, the four of us, five of us sometimes. And I will admit that having been on television now for a while, I'm beginning to like being recognized in public. And just recently we were traveling someplace and we were in the airport, and Bob Novak and Mark Shields went off to get a hot dog and left me guarding the luggage. I volunteered. And I saw a woman coming over to me with a big smile, and I smiled back, ready to be recognized, and she came over and she said, "You were with those two distinguished gentlemen." I sort of wilted, and then I got a little huffy, and I said, "I was not with distinguished gentlemen." Well, I bring you greetings from the city that Bill Clinton spent his entire life trying to reach, and now spends most of his time complaining that it just isn't Little Rock, Washington, D.C. I think it's safe to say that these are not happy days for the first couple. Mrs. Clinton, in what I like to call her Ross Perot mode, told Elle magazine that there is a well-financed, well-organized conspiracy to undermine her husband and herself. I would love for someone to ask her just who is financing it. Next, she'll be complaining about a Republican plot to disrupt Chelsea's Sweet 16. President Clinton says that Hillary is under unjust attack. He says she has the most finely honed sense of right and wrong of anybody he has ever known. Al D'Amato heard that and he said, "Maybe that's the problem." Now, President Clinton has blamed all of his current troubles on the mean Republicans. He's come to town, he says, ready to cure every ill in American society. And all Republicans can say is, and let me sure to get this quote exactly right, no, 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 no. That's 9 no's. Now, there are many Republicans who hear that indictment and get nervous. They fear to be seen as the obstructionist party, the party of gridlock. What they need is a little spine. There are lots of things worthy of saying no to. It was Aristotle who first taught that the moral education of a person is not complete unless he is taught to love that which is lovable and hate that which is hateful. Republicans must learn a similar lesson in the political sphere. There's nothing wrong with being negative if you're being negative about terrible things. When the Clinton administration proposes tax increases and more spending on the Rural Electrification Administration, urban mass transit, the honeybee subsidy, and federal job training programs, which never work, the Republicans should respond with a resounding no. When the Clinton administration proposes to drop the ban on homosexuals in the military, Republicans should say no. When the Clinton administration endorses federal funding for abortions throughout the 9 months of pregnancy, the Republicans should say no. And most assuredly, when the Clinton administration proposes a federal takeover of 1/7 of our economy, the health sector, Republicans should shout no from the rooftops. In that same speech, President Clinton went on to complain that Republicans are committed to, quote, the politics of personal destruction. I never did them the way they are doing me, he said. Now, leaving aside the good old boy locution, that statement is worthy of a response. It reminds me of the story of the soldier in World War II who goes to his sergeant and pleads, "Sarge, you gotta let me out there. I want to kill Japs. I want to kill Germans. Let me out there." The sergeant says, "Well, it's fine initiative, Joe, but you better be careful out there. Remember, they're going to be shooting at you, too." The soldier says, "At me? What have they got against me?" Now, Mr. Clinton has a selective memory. He remembers the 1980s, he now says, as a time when he, as governor of Arkansas, volunteered to work side by side with Republican administrations in the White House. Has he forgotten that during the 1992 presidential contest, he was at the front of the pack decrying the 1980s as the decade of greed? Did he not imply that Republican policies were at fault for everything from homelessness to the S&L debacle to unemployment to potholes in Boise? Mr. Clinton is obviously experiencing the Whitewater drama, what some are calling Rodham and Gomorrah, in a painful and very personal way, and that's understandable, of course. But he is blinded, I think, to what's the larger picture here. I don't recall Mr. Clinton coming to the defense of numerous Republicans who've been subjected to exactly the same kind of treatment over the past 20 years since Watergate, and frequently worse treatment. In fact, not only did Mr. Clinton not come to the defense of Republicans, but Mrs. Clinton was ready with a bouquet for Anita Hill when the American Bar Association honored Ms. Hill. What Mr. Clinton seems to be forgetting in his distress is that Democrats created this monster, the omnivorous scandal machine. Whipping up scandal about Republicans has been the favorite leisure activity in Washington for 20 years. First time they wheeled it out of the shop in 1973, it felled a president, and they've been using it ever since to maim those with whom they disagree. Bob Dole did a count the other day, and he came up with 25 different congressional investigations of Republicans by the Congress between 1981 and 1992, including the infamous hearings on the absurd October surprise story. Juan Williams, a reporter for the Washington Post, recalled how, after Clarence Thomas was nominated for the Supreme Court, interest groups allied with the Democratic Party were calling around town asking if anyone had any dirt on him. They weren't prepared for a principled debate over political or judicial philosophy. They didn't want to oppose him. They wanted to destroy him personally, and they very nearly succeeded. As Congressman Henry Hyde said of the Republican response to Whitewater, quote, "You have to remember the position that all Republicans have been in for 12 years, where we were investigated, sometimes frivolously. If we get a chance to point a finger, why, it requires a saintliness that is superhuman, supernatural, to act with restraint." Countless Republicans have felt the sting of the scandal machine. It's been used with varying degrees of success against Ronald Reagan, George Bush, Robert Bork, Clarence Thomas, Ed Meese, Richard Allen, Carol Iannone, Raymond Donovan, Theodore Olson, Elliott Abrams, Caspar Weinberger, and John Tower, among many others. Republicans will be forgiven if they look upon the Democrats' distress over Whitewater and smile to themselves, saying, "See how it feels? You endure the innuendo and inaccurate stories. You go out and hire private lawyers with your own money. You worry about finding yourself disbarred, or worse, in jail." President Clinton and his allies are lamenting the fact that press preoccupation with Whitewater distracts the Capitol and the country from the important work that needs doing. That is almost verbatim what Richard Nixon said in 1973 and 1974, and what Ronald Reagan said during Iran-Contra. And it's true. Scandals do change the climate. They are a distraction. Often, that is their sole purpose. I firmly believe that in the case of Clarence Thomas, the coalition of professional complainers, self-described victims, and character assassins who tried to derail him did so because they simply could not tolerate the idea of a conservative black sitting in Thurgood Marshall's seat. And there are some Republicans, I think, who do not have the stomach or the brains to take this president on, and naively hope that the Whitewater scandal will do for Republicans in the 1990s what Watergate did for the Democrats in the 1970s. They are dreaming. Did the Clintons engage in some unsavory and possibly illegal conduct? It sure looks like it. Did they engage in fraud? Very possibly. Do they owe massive back taxes? I think so. Is this going to result in impeachment? Not hardly. The Clintons are Democrats, after all, in a town controlled by Democrats. The Democratic Congress just isn't going to saute a president of their own party the way they would a Republican. And the press consists almost entirely of Democrats as well. Of all the working journalists that I know, columnists excluded, I can think of only one conservative, Brit Hume. You know the story about how the major newspapers would report the story of the end of the world? The New York Times would run a 2-column headline saying, "World to end tomorrow, details page A6. USA Today would have a headline saying, "End of world," and the subhead would say, "How we really feel about it." The Wall Street Journal's front page would have a small headline saying, "Bond market jittery on end of world fears." And the Washington Post would have a banner headline saying, "World ends tomorrow, Reagan tax cuts blamed." So Mr. Fisk will complete his investigation and possibly rap Mrs. Clinton firmly on the knuckles for tax improprieties. Remember, this is the woman who deducted $2.50 for every old T-shirt of Bill's that she donated to the Salvation Army. And that will be that, I think. Very embarrassing, but not fatal. If the Republicans want to unseat Mr. Clinton in 1996, they will have to do so by proving that his policies are bad for the country, not just that his private life, both personal and business, is on the order of a swamp. I'm at a loss to explain the lassitude of most leading Republicans in the face of the Clinton challenge. After all, what we have in Bill Clinton is precisely the opposite of the kind of leadership the country needs and wants. Bill Clinton and the administration he heads is the last gasp of the 1960s. Just as America was starting to recover from the hangover that started in 1968, along comes Bill Clinton to enshrine the counterculture at Health and Human Services and HUD and Defense and most especially at Justice. Mr. Clinton is clever enough to understand that the electorate has limited taste for liberalism, and so he does something to keep his program palatable. He lies. He campaigns on a platform to, quote, end welfare as we know it, unquote. And as soon as he is in office, he gives huge funding increases, $110 billion over 5 years, to all existing welfare programs. His good friend Marion Wright Edelman, chairman of the Children's Defense Fund, the most successful champion of the welfare state in America, couldn't be happier. Mr. Clinton gives stirring speeches about the need to get the deficit under control, but proposes a budget that will increase it. He then congratulates himself for being the first president to take budget reduction seriously. Hold it. Wasn't George Bush persuaded to abandon his no new taxes pledge and risk his presidency in order to tackle the deficit? Isn't that why he signed a huge tax increase? President Clinton talks tough about crime, but names as Attorney General a woman whose views can only be described as antique. I have heard Janet Reno say that she thinks the way to handle the problem of violence is to give more psychological counseling to offenders. Unless, of course, the offenders happen to be Branch Davidians, in which case she calls in the 3rd Infantry Armored Battalion. President Clinton put distance between himself and Jesse Jackson during the campaign of 1992, we recall, conspicuously signaling that he did not favor the policies of group entitlements. Yet once in office, he tried to install Lonnie Guinier, a woman whose views on quotas make Jesse Jackson look like Jesse Helms, in the key civil rights post. At Health and Human Services, President Clinton has installed Donna Shalala, and in the Surgeon General's slot, Joycelyn Elders, thus dealing a 1-2 punch to sane social policy. If you missed the press conference at which these ladies and others, including AIDS czar Christine Getty, introduced their television commercials for condom ads, you really missed something. Here you had the appointed leaders of key government agencies unveiling an ad in which a condom does a little two-step across the floor as an answer to the AIDS epidemic. My friend Bill Bennett says the 2 sacraments of the Clinton church are taxes and condoms. They like them. They like them all the time. They like them even when they don't work. Is this what America thought it was getting when it gave Mr. Clinton a plurality victory in 1992? I don't think so. I think there is a real appetite in the electorate for profound and thoroughgoing reform of government. It was that hunger, I believe, that was primarily behind the Perot phenomenon. People didn't necessarily agree with everything Mr. Perot proposed, and they certainly didn't like the fact that Mr. Perot's personality resembled Captain Queeg's. But a significant number of voters were so disgusted with the policies coming out of Washington that they voted for Perot just to bust up the joint. As Peggy Noonan put it, they looked at Ross Perot and saw a hand grenade with a bad haircut. What kind of reform do people want? That is less than clear. Mr. Clinton is gambling that he can gin up enough support for health reform to pass some sort of program by the end of this year. His reasons for choosing health care are very clear. His pollster, Mr. Stan Greenberg, told him that the broad middle class has become disenchanted with government, that they do not think the taxes they wind up paying benefit people like themselves. What Mr. and Mrs. Rodham Clinton are hoping to do is to create another huge government entitlement, perhaps the biggest so far, that will wed the middle class to big government and accordingly to the Democratic Party. They're running into difficulties, though, for several reasons. I'll list them in no particular order. 1, 80% of Americans are happy with the health care that they are getting, though it should be stipulated that a couple of problems, portability and pre-existing conditions, need correcting. 2, people are skeptical now about the ability of government, the outfit that brought us the SNL disaster and the $900 toilet seat, to make anything more efficient and less costly. 3, Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, a Democrat, chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, says that there is no health care crisis But there is a welfare crisis, and he will hold any health legislation hostile to welfare reform. 4, the actual details of the Clinton plan are coming out, and people are becoming alarmed about the rationing and diminution of quality that will inevitably result. Here's what the Democrats' own Congressional Budget Office said about the alliances that are a keystone of the Clinton plan. Quote, they would combine the functions of purchasing agents, contract negotiators, welfare agencies, financial intermediaries, collectors of premiums, developers and managers of information systems, and coordinators of the flow of information and money between themselves and other alliances. They would also have to implement the controls on premiums under the direction of the National Health Board. Any one of these functions would be a major undertaking for an existing agency with some experience, let alone for a new agency that would have to perform them all, unquote. Jody Allen, an editor at the Washington Post and no conservative, contributed this further insight about the health alliances. She said, quote, does anybody seriously believe they will work? Are the president and his wife, who declined to entrust the education of their child to the local government, really willing to let it take over the major role in deciding their health care options? Are you? Unquote. Well, I know my answer. For all of those reasons, and thanks to effective lobbying by the insurance industry and others, the Clintonista health plan is bogging down. What hasn't been emphasized enough is that the data Mrs. Rodham Clinton and her husband used to justify this massive federal takeover of the health care industry are totally wrong. The so-called 37 million uninsured, for example, that figure is nonsense. Most of those people are uninsured for only part of the year. Only 9 million are without insurance for 2 years or more. Also, many of those who lack insurance have made a decision to go without it. In many cases, it's a not unreasonable choice. After all, fully 64% of the uninsured are under the age of 39, and young people tend not to get seriously ill. The Clinton plan would mean rationing of care. They can deny it all they like, but they simply cannot extend coverage to all of those who now lack it and keep prices steady without engaging in rationing. By the way, all the talk of cost control is blowing smoke. The government cannot control the cost of anything. It can only control the price, and that always leads to disasters. What the Clintons are up to is the biggest power grab of modern times. Its ambition dwarfs that of happy socialists like Hubert Humphrey. Incredibly, the Clinton crowd lived through the 1970s, the 1980s, and half of the 1990s without being touched by the large lessons the whole world has been learning about free markets. In Prague and Moscow, they're trying to learn about preferred versus common stock. But in Washington, the Clintons are trying to socialize our healthcare system. It's no wonder that the Clinton foreign policy team has had trouble with the Chinese. The Chinese believe that markets should be free and politics should be controlled. The Clintons believe the opposite. While there is no national consensus in favor of health reform, there is near unanimity on the need for welfare reform. People recognize that many of our most intractable problems, crime, urban decay, poor educational performance, and more, are traceable to the staggering rate of illegitimacy. The rate of white illegitimacy today is just where the rate of black illegitimacy was in 1965 when Moynihan issued his famous report on the black family. The black rate has risen since then to 60%, up to 80 and 90% in some cities, but the white rate is rising faster. The current welfare system rewards young women for having babies they cannot support. This is madness. But let me sketch how the welfare reform debate is going in Washington. On the right, there is the redoubtable Charles Murray, author of Losing Ground, who argues that the only thing to do with the welfare system is to eliminate it. Anything else, he argues, will not solve the problem of generation after generation being born into poverty and hopelessness. On the left, you have the poverty lobby, pressing for reforms that would make welfare even more attractive than it is today. They want more job training, more benefits, and benefits that continue after the welfare recipient has found a job. If President Clinton is true to form, he will propose a welfare reform that incorporates all of the ideas of the left, but he will make a grand speech to a joint session of Congress using all of the rhetoric of the right. The Republican opposition has rarely been so lame as it is today. Leaderless and timid, it is quite possible that they will permit President Clinton to get away with the deception. as they have done several times before. But I will tell you this, any Republican who came forward with a zeal for reform and concrete proposals could steal a march on 1996. I'm a great admirer of Charles Murray, but I think his proposal to eliminate welfare is unrealistic. He knows that. He's trying to move the debate, and that's fine. But there are politically achievable things that we should be trying. Several states are experimenting with limiting the benefits to mothers on welfare who have more children. Rule is, when you're on welfare, if you have another baby, your monthly check will not increase. Working families have to calculate whether they can afford another child all the time. The dependent poor should have to make the same calculations. Another important reform. Under our current system, we give young girls who get pregnant a housing allowance. What this allows them to do is move out of their mother's home, it's almost always their mother, and set up an apartment for themselves. This is, not to put too fine a point on it, a strong incentive to have an illegitimate baby. A sensible reform, and a good one for the health and well-being of the mothers, and more important, their children, would be to set these women up in group homes with strict curfews, chores, and mandatory child care classes. One of the most heartbreaking things about young unmarried mothers raising kids is their total incompetence at handling children. Many, especially the youngest ones, do not know, for example, that when a baby cries, it needs something. It is not being bad. Thus, two goals would be achieved simultaneously. The incentive to have babies in order to become independent of mom would disappear, and the children born to unwed mothers would live in a setting less likely to lead to poor parenting and abuse. Those reforms would be a true departure from the way we've been doing business for 30 years, and I believe they would be quite popular. But I'm skeptical about the ability of the Republican Party to seize the initiative and become the party of reform. The Democrats have been in power at every level of government, except the White House, for my entire lifetime. And while many of the changes that have swept the country during this time were not caused directly by government or politicians, government and politicians have been accomplices in an increasingly corrupt culture. I was talking with Mort Kondracki recently. He said the Republican Party needs to avoid being seen as lacking compassion. Well, I turned on poor Mort with a furious answer that's been building up for years. And I said, what have you avatars of compassion achieved in 30 years? When tourists land at American airports, they get the keys to their rental cars and instructions about how to stay alive on the drive to their hotel. That's what compassion has done for them. If they're lucky enough to be spared by the thugs and hoodlums who prey upon the weak, they will see trash and graffiti marring the bridges and buildings of the city. That's what compassion has done for our public spaces. Or look at it from the point of view of a child, especially a black child who lives in any of our large cities, cities that have been run by Democrats for decades. That child must pass through a metal detector on her way through the schoolhouse door. She must sleep at night to the sound of gunfire. And in school, she will be taught not reading, writing, and arithmetic, but racial separatism, revisionist history, and reproductive rights. She'll need a note from her mother to get an aspirin from the school nurse, but will be offered condoms on her lunch tray. She won't be allowed to pray, but then when she sees how teachers cower before fully armed students, she'll sure want to. This is the compassionate utopia that 30 years of Democratic dominance have given us. No, Republicans need not fear being tarred with the no compassion brush. Compassion is an essential human sentiment. It is a virtue. But we have gotten badly off track in America, extolling compassion above all other virtues. In fact, losing sight of other virtues entirely. Do justice, love mercy, says the Bible. Justice comes first. We have forgotten the virtues of justice, of self-control, of independence, courage, fortitude, honesty, perseverance, and self-sacrifice. It's important to be compassionate, but it's also important to be fair, tough-minded, and trustworthy. We have an urgent need to reinstill those virtues in a nation gone soft on Oprah and Donahue and fantasies of victimization. I was reading about the sentencing of Tonya Harding the other day. The prosecutors were eager, they said, for a plea bargain because they were afraid what a jury might do in the face of her claim to have been abused by her husband. After the hung juries in the Menendez cases, the acquittal of serious charges of Damian Williams, who was caught smashing a brick into the head of Reginald Denny on videotape, and the acquittal of Lorena Bobbitt, the prosecutors of Tonya Harding were sensible to worry. We are the most prosperous, comfortable, safe nation in the world with a quality of life second to none. but we've come to view ourselves as pathetic victims of circumstance, hapless casualties of childhood abuse or addiction, or too much sugar from Twinkies. Much of this is beyond the scope of politics. It's a decay of the spirit. But government and politics can at least stop abetting the decline. The Democrats, and especially the Clintons, have forgotten the first rule of getting out of holes: quit digging. If Republicans hope to regain the White House and, what is more important, take control of the Congress and state legislatures, they need to learn the same lesson. The time for timidity and going along to get along is past. The time for real reform is at hand. Thank you. Well, you're absolutely right that the media are hypocrites. They were willing to take the accusation of Anita Hill at face value with absolutely no evidence and drag Clarence Thomas through the worst experience that anybody could go through in politics on the basis of that flimsy accusation, whereas substantiated accusations against Bill Clinton are not given the same prominence. There are lots of reasons for that beyond the fact that it's a liberal media. I mean, it is a sitting president, and I think different rules apply. But as for people not knowing enough about Whitewater, I think that will be a self-correcting problem, because when the hearings are broadcast, people will be able to learn a great deal. And there's really nothing that the press can do. They will not be standing, as they so often are, as a filter between what happens and the American people. The American people will be able to watch it in real time. Well, grassroots activity has been enormously successful in certain places. New York City, recently, the sensible parents in New York got together when the elite Board of Education was attempting to foist upon New York City school children something called the Rainbow Curriculum, which was basically an advertisement for homosexuality and other things. The parents got together and stopped it. And not only did they stop that curriculum, they were able to remove the school's chancellor, Joseph Fernandez. So that's an example of what people can do when they get involved. I think that in general we are far too passive, allowing things to be done in our names when we do not approve. So the first thing I would do is make sure that my school curriculum is something that I approve of for my kids. I would advertise the records of people in Congress. That is something that was done in 1980. I was talking with one of the students about this. 1980, there was something called NICPAC, which was an organization that existed basically to inform voters about the true voting records of the people who were representing them in Congress and in the Senate. And in every case, very, very liberal senators were going back to their home districts, and congressmen as well, and presenting themselves as moderates or even conservatives, and then voting, 100% ADA-approved voting records in the House in Washington. So what they did is they advertised the true voting records of these people. They bought time and banded together and did that, and it had a terrific effect. They unseated about 6 very liberal senators. Did everybody hear the question? The question was, what do I think the connection may be between Vince Foster's death and the Clinton White House and Whitewater? And the second question was, who do I think are the front runners for the Republican nomination, 96? Foster's death. I was skeptical about the story that the Clintons put out, that we'll never know, and he was simply depressed and so on, because while I know, having worked in the White House, I know that there are certainly pressures that come to bear upon a person working in the White House, there are also compensating pleasures. So the idea that this very high-powered attorney from Little Rock came here and simply couldn't stand the pressure, came to Washington, that is, couldn't stand the pressure and had to shoot himself, didn't quite ring true for me. And I do think it is eminently possible, when you look at the complications of the Whitewater deals and what he was working on the day he died, which, by the way, violates a federal law. He was working on the the Whitewater tax returns, old tax returns that had to be amended. It violates a federal law because federal employees are not permitted to do their boss's personal business on government time. But it's probably a law more honored in the breach than in the observance, but Kay Bailey Hutchison was indicted for very much less than that. In any event, I do believe it was a suicide. All the evidence points that direction. I think it's kind of getting off too far into the world of fantasy to think that it might have been a murder, or people are saying, well, it's Hillary, you know. It's people have gotten a little giddy about all of this stuff. But I think it is eminently possible, in light of all the things that are coming out, that he was depressed because he recognized how damaging the Whitewater information would be to this administration if it became public, and he had a role in that. So that's what I see as the possible link. Regarding the 1996 Republican nominee, it is wide open. Anything can happen. What Ross Perot demonstrated, I think, rules in order to be taken seriously as a possible president. And there's one more factor to take into account, and that is that next year the process will be very front-loaded. The California primaries in March 1995, rather than in June. So the whole thing will be over by March 30th. That gives the advantage to those candidates who have the early money. And right now, Phil Gramm has a lot of money. I think Cheney has the ability to raise money. And Jack Kemp is still very popular at the grassroots. So we shall see. I think much depends upon who wants it the most. And if I were asked to bet, though I wouldn't put very much money on it, a nickel, I would say Phil Gramm. Well, I hope so, because if the Republicans remain what I have called the less of the same party, they will never be a majority party. Less of the same. You know, they are for whatever the Democrats are for, just less of the same. It has not been a winning strategy. It's not how Ronald Reagan won 49 states. And you're right, there is far too much of a tendency on the part of many Republican office holders to simply try to sort of toe the Democratic line in a modified form. I will tell you one quick story that I think exemplifies this. It's told by Bill Bennett, but it's a great story, which is, you remember in that debate in East Lansing during 1992 when the fellow with the ponytail stood up and said to the candidates, you know, I don't want to hear this negative campaigning. Well, everybody focused on that part. But then he went on to say, I want to know how you're going to meet our needs. How are you going to meet our needs as president? Well, each one gave a response, some better than others. But nobody said, excuse me, I'm not running as daddy. Meet your own needs. Go see a priest. Go see a rabbi. Get a job. Take care of yourself. And it would be very refreshing if a serious candidate would do something like that. You're touching a raw nerve. I said on international television that Dan Rostenkowski was going to lose that primary, and he had the voters had the effrontery to prove me wrong. But I do think he'll be indicted. There is a lot of evidence against him, and it seems now that the only way to unseat these corrupt politicians is through indictment, that the voters simply won't do the hard work themselves. Very depressing. Well, it's very, very tough, which is why, you know, when you talk about reform, it's very important to focus on House races and Senate races, not just on the presidency. And it's another problem with Republicans is they're much too oriented toward the head and not enough toward the body, which is actually more important, much more important. I'd rather have both houses of Congress and let the Democrats have the presidency than the other way around. But there are, that much having been said, there are options that the minority has. And Newt Gingrich has said that if Henry Gonzalez, the chairman of the Banking Committee, does not permit questions on Whitewater, that the Republicans will simply close the place down by refusing to cooperate on any kind of legislation, and then they'll have to give way. Can we establish the accountability of the federal government? Well, they're really having ceded so much authority to the federal government, that is going to be a very long and slow process to, you know, every Republican president has had some sort of a program called federalism, meaning, you know, returning authority and money and so on to the states, and it has never had the impact of actually returning authority to the states. I think the only way to do that is for people to elect people to Washington who they know understand the philosophy of limited government, and we'll all wait for that day. He said, now that the Brady bill is passed and we all feel much safer, What is the gun lobby going to do next? Is that what you were going to say? The anti-gun people? Yeah. I'm not sure what their next step is legislatively. Obviously, we all know what their aim is long term. You know, they would like to limit the ability of ordinary people to go out and buy weapons to defend themselves, and make sure that the only people who have guns are the criminals. I don't know how successful that will be. The Brady bill was passed with Republican support in the end. Because the kinds of proposals that were in the Brady bill, while utterly ineffective, waiting periods have no influence, have no effect on crime rates and so on, were at least relatively inoffensive to people who are concerned about the right to bear arms. Some of the other things that they may have up their sleeves would be less tolerable, and there are even a lot of Democrats out there who understand that the Second Amendment has teeth. Part of the answer is that this country is not as conservative as some of us would like to think it is. If this were a really conservative country, there would be resistance to some of the encroachments that the liberals have imposed from Washington. There has not been that kind of resistance. When Dan Rostenkowski's voters, now these are Democratic primary voters, but you see this in other districts as well, return to the Congress an out-and-out crook, because he brings home the bacon, they are engaged in a little game that they will not say explicitly, but everybody understands, is my job is to send to Congress a better thief than any other district can send to Congress, so that we will get back more than we send in. And the Democrats dress it up by saying that this means you are compassionate, and this means that you are a caring person, and aren't you for the elderly, and aren't you for mass transit, and aren't you for women, infants, and children, and so on. And the Republicans find it is much harder philosophically to make the case, and especially when voters can vote you up or down. It is a lot harder sell to say, let me explain to you why I'm not going to vote for women, infants, and children health care, but here's why it's better for the country in the long run. That's harder sell. And that's why you have fewer people, I think, out there ready and willing to take on that kind of a burden. I think it can be done. I think it should be done. I think it's essential. And I think you can even sell hard things, as Ross Perot was able to do. He was for a 50-cent a gallon gas tax, and people voted for him. So I think it is possible, but it is a harder sell than being Santa Claus, which is what the Democrats campaign as.
Does that satisfy your need, Dr. Schramm? Thank you very much.